Everyone to today's great talk with Rolf Traeger. Look beyond the mask, the economic impact of the pandemic on poorest countries. Rolf Traeger is chief of the least developed countries section of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, and he coordinates the research and writing of the flagship publication, the Least Developed Countries Report. Based on his research work, he undertakes capacity building and training activities for policymakers and researchers. He has worked at the United Nations for almost 30 years. His main research interests include sustainable development strategies and policies, structural transformation, technology and innovation, poverty, international trade, and economic geography. Rolf shared with us a very interesting note that is called When It Rains, It Pours. COVID-19 exacerbates poverty risk in the poorest countries, that was written by Paul Akiwumi and Giovanni Valencisi of the Division of Africa and Least Developed Countries of UNCTAD. As the number of COVID-19 cases continues to rise in Africa and Southern Asia, and also in Latin America, poorest countries are hit more than the others. So again, thank you very much, Rolf, for being with us and for having your time with us. And let's get started. Manuela, our Vice President in Gray Cells and former UNCTAD professional, will conduct the session. So please, Manuela, let's get started.
Yes, absolutely. I will conduct that Gray Cells and more than former UNCTAD colleague of Rolf. But anyway, Rolf, you have the floor. So the rules of the game are very simple. You share with us your main ideas and the slides that you prepared. And then immediately we will give the floor to the participants. Please, as I was saying minutes ago, the column on the right of your screen, which is the chat column, use it to write your questions or comments, but do it in such a way that they are short sentences with keywords, because otherwise sometimes I have a dissertation in that column, which is very difficult to manage when preparing questions and interacting with the speaker. So keep it short and sharp. And then also please close your mic because that improves the sound for everybody. Rolf, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Manuela. Thank you, Alejandro. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in the Gray Cell talks. And I just wanted to start with a disclaimer. As Alejandro said, yes, I work for UNCTAD. I'm chief of the LDC section. But of course, here I'm talking on my personal capacity. I'm not talking on behalf of UNCTAD, the UN, or whoever. Okay, but of course, whatever I'll be saying is to a large extent based on our work of research and analysis on the LDCs. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Do you get it? Okay. Also, I mean, I don't know if all of you are very familiar with the LDCs. Let me just start by recalling who they are. The least developed countries are a group of 47 countries. It's basically the poorest countries in the world. As you can see, there is a big concentration in Africa. Most LDCs are in Africa, and conversely, most African countries are LDCs, particularly if you take out Northern Africa, most of Southern Africa, and Nigeria. Most other African countries are LDCs. Okay, then you have the continental Asian countries. You have the Pacific island countries like Tuvalu, Vanuatu, Kiribati, and you have one in the Americas that's Haiti. So, if you, just to see where LDCs stand in the world, in terms of numbers of countries, the LDCs, they are basically 1/4 of the member states of the United Nations, since there are 47 countries. In terms of population, they are almost 14% of the population of the world, and this proportion is increasing because population growth is quicker in the LDCs than in all other country groups. Okay, but when you look at the economy, their weight is much, much smaller. I mean, basically, the LDCs account for slightly in excess of just 1% of world GDP and just over again 1% of world trade. So what is the consequence if your population in the as a share of the world is much higher than your GDP as a share of the world? Well, mechanically, it means that your income per capita is much lower than that of other country groups. So on average, you can see that the GDP per capita of the LDCs is just slightly above $1,000 per head, which is less than 1/6 of the average of our other developing countries, meaning taking all the developing countries which are not LDCs. And if you compare it to the income level of developed countries, it's a fraction, it's 1/45th of the income level of developed countries. Okay. So let's see, before we go into the analysis of the pandemic and of its economic consequences, let me provide you with some background information on the economic state of the LDCs before the outbreak of the pandemic. First of all, in recent years, particularly since 2008-9, since the outbreak of the Great Crisis, you had a much slower growth of the LDC economies than during the 2000s. Back then, the LDCs were benefiting from very high commodity prices, but after 2008-9, and particularly after 2011, the rate of economic growth has slowed down considerably. And also as a consequence of this, the path of poverty reduction in the LDCs has slowed down also considerably. And basically since 2013, the poverty rate in LDCs has become basically stagnant, hovering around 1/3 of the population. And here I'm talking about absolute poverty, what nowadays means poverty at less than $2 a day. So it's basically for the last 7 years, it's grossly 1/3 of the population which remains stubbornly at this level of poverty. But this means, since the population of the LDCs is growing very fast, that the actual number of the poor people, of the extremely poor people in LDCs, is actually increasing. At the same time, you have had a growing financial integration of the LDCs into the international economy, into the world economy. And this means that LDCs have been able to access international financial markets increasingly, but this also means that the level of foreign debt has been increasing very rapidly. Also because of the either sluggish growth or stagnation of other sources of financing, particularly ODA, official development assistance. And as you can see, in a space of just 10 years, the level of foreign debt of the LDC simply doubled from $146 billion to $300 billion. And this is an issue, this was already an issue before the outbreak of the crisis, because already then we had 1/3 of the LDCs which were classified as being in debt distress or high risk of debt distress, meaning that they were having serious difficulties in managing their foreign debt. Further, these are economies with a very high level of informality, frequently at the level of 60 to 70% of the economy in the informal sector, which from a social point of view means that quite often, and often related to this, you have quite weak levels of social protection, even though some countries have tried to put up some sort of social safety nets like unemployment benefits, etc. Usually the means that they have to implement these types of social safety nets are rather weak. Okay? And this means that the LDCs continue to be very vulnerable. Very vulnerable to what? Particularly to all sorts of external shocks, be they trade shocks, climate shocks, financial shocks, economic shocks, and of course, as we'll see nowadays, health shocks, which is the type of external shock that we had almost forgotten that existed, but now we have a stark reminder that they do exist and how serious they can be. And what about the situation of the health system in the LDCs? Well, you have to think that the health system is typically part and parcel of the state and level of state capacities, particularly if you're talking about developing countries. I mean, this is true all over the world, but particularly so in the LDCs. And what you have in most LDCs, certainly not all, is that you have deficient or weak state capacities for many reasons, structural reasons, historical reasons, but also policy reasons, but also the fact that some of these countries are post-conflict countries or are still in conflict. And I mean, as examples of both, you have Yemen, you have Sudan, you have South Sudan, Central African Republic, well, if you take a bigger distance, Sierra Leone, etc., in Western Africa. Okay. And specifically, the health system, particularly in African LDCs, tends to have some serious deficiency, which of course become absolutely obvious at the time of health emergency or an epidemic or a pandemic. So if you look at the number of doctors per 1,000 people, this is a statistic for all of Africa, but again, remember that most African countries are LDCs. In Africa, you have 0.3 doctors per 1,000 people, whereas in Latin America is 1.6. So it's 5 times as much as that. Or in the case of OECD countries, it's 10 times as many. Now, if you look at another indicator, which has become particularly important now with this pandemic, it's the number of intensive care units per 100,000 inhabitants. You see that in Africa, it's 1.7 ICUs per 100,000 inhabitants, whereas in China, it's double this. But if you compare it with the situation of the United States, it's probably some 20 times higher. So, I mean, these and many other indicators, again, confirm the deficiencies of the health system I mean, here we're talking about Africa, but this applies to a big number of LDCs. And this considering that there has already been some improvement, particularly after particularly in some Western African health systems after the outbreak of the Ebola crisis. Okay. And now, how has this pandemic been faring in the LDCs? Well, first of all, you have the fact that these countries have been hit much later than other countries like Asian countries, particularly East Asian countries, Europe, even the Americas. And some LDCs even started reporting to the WHO their cases of infection or health as late as May. But I mean, the number of 100 cases of infection, here I'm putting all of the LDCs together. So remember, this is the total for the 47 countries. It just reached the number of 100 infections for all of the LDCs, basically in mid-March. But what you have seen is that it has been increasing continuously. So if you accumulate all of the cases, we are at 75,000 cases, new cases of COVID infection. Now, what about the deaths? Here again, the first death due to COVID was reported again back in mid-March. And you see that it has been increasing continuously. But still, if you think that these are 47 countries, the accumulated number of deaths is just 1,500 for 47 countries. And considering that these countries have a combined population of more than 1 billion inhabitants, this is a relatively low death rate, okay? But what is worrying there is that we are clearly in the upward phase of the epidemic, of the pandemic, and we see apparently no signs of flattening of the curve. So what have been the reactions to the outbreak of the pandemic in the LDCs? First of all, it's important to notice that they have varied much. Just like in let's say, advanced countries or in East Asian countries, they have varied considerably in terms of the type of reaction, but also the efficiency of reaction. Also among the LDCs, the efficiency of the type of reaction, it has varied a lot, okay? And so many countries, or even most of them, they have adopted containment measures. There were now what has become very familiar to us: quarantine, lockdowns, travel bans, etc. But also, it has been pointed out that there has been innovation according to local conditions, which is, of course, fitting, because we know very well that what has worked in other countries will not work necessarily in an LDC context, also because the conditions are so much different. But I mean, this refers to very simple information sharing by using traditional leaders and religious leaders, as was done in several countries, like Sierra Leone, where, of course, even access to internet or even radio is not available to all the population, particularly those who live in the rural areas. Or in the case of Rwanda, they have these movable sinks which have been put in crucial transit areas like bus stations, etc., public places, which is a way of making running water and soap available to the population at crucial points of their going back and forth, okay? So there have been some positive signs, also because of the fact that the pandemic arrived later, typically to these countries than to other countries. They had some time to get prepared. But there are always buts. You have had some cases of refusal of foreign assistance. For instance, Jack Ma, the boss of Alibaba, made a big donation of PPE, of personal protection equipment, to many African countries, but the government of Eritrea refused it. later it bought from China, of course, at a cost. Okay, so that's not necessarily the best thing to do. But also some other governments have used or have proposed some not very efficient measures, like one president of an Eastern African LDC told the population that they should go to the churches and mosques to pray against COVID. So that's not necessarily what is most advised by health authorities and health experts. Or there is another president, again in East Africa, who has been promoting the drinking of traditional type of beverage based on a specific plant, which has no efficiency proved whatsoever in terms of combating. So I mean, this shows that depending on different states capacities, and on different types of governance that you have in place, you have more or less a decisive reaction, more or less efficient reaction to the pandemic. And by the way, this is true in LDCs, this is true all over the world. So maybe we don't know what the future of the pandemic will be. As we have seen so far, the results have been anything but catastrophic. It has been relatively contained. You had Bill Gates back in March saying that it would be an absolute catastrophe in Africa, that Africa would have 10 million deaths of COVID. For the time being, we are far from that. Of course, it's very hazardous to say anything at this point. But and of course, we have to continue following what is happening on the pandemic side. But we can already figure out some of the economic consequences, okay? And as things stand now, we can say that it looks like it's likely that economic consequences of the pandemic will be much more devastating and much more serious than the health consequences of the pandemic. Okay, and this is to the extent that we can make some economic forecasts, but of course, health forecasts are much more difficult to make. Okay, so here you have some forecasts which have been made for, well, actually for all countries. These are IMF forecasts which are revised every 6 months. And back in October last year, that was barely 7 months ago, they were foreseeing a growth rate, an average growth rate of 4.5% of GDP. Don't forget that LDCs are poor, etc. They have structural impediments, etc., etc. But in spite of this, many of them had experienced very, very rapid growth over the last 10 years, as was the case of countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, etc. Well, nowadays, the forecasts have been revised, and for this year, there is a mild average recession, which is forecast for the average LDC. But I mean, this is total GDP. If you think in terms of GDP per capita, of course, the figures are much lower, again, because of rapid population growth. You can see that 7 months ago, there was a forecast of an increase in average GDP per capita of 2.5% for this year, but now it's forecast to fall. So remember, despite this level of accelerated growth, you still have this very strong prevalence of poverty, low income levels on average, and this is going to fall further this year. So the economic consequences are clearly very, very negative. And the question is, why is this so? And there are many reasons for this. So there are many reasons why this recession and fall in per capita income is foreseen. So first of all, you have the containment policies, again, the lockdowns, the travel bans, etc. This, by their very nature, they have as a consequence a reduction in the level of economic activity, reduction in business activity, in government revenues, etc., and hence in government spending, etc. And again, loss of employment, reduction of labor earnings, etc., etc. This is true in other countries. This is just as true in LDCs, of course, with the aggravating fact that you had all of the preceding situation, which was very worrisome. But particularly, it's the international recession which is already hitting the LDCs very seriously, and this through a number of channels. First of all, the prices of the goods that LDCs exports, many of them are going down, but also the quantities of the goods that LDCs export, they are also going down. Just think about oil. The state of the world oil market is in a rut these days. A couple of weeks ago, oil prices went even for the very first time in history into negative territory. But in markets, you are somewhere around $20 a barrel, whereas at the end of last year, we almost reached the level of $70 a barrel. And this, of course, will hurt very seriously the economies of those countries which are most dependent on oil exports. It's particularly the case of Angola, of Chad, of Mozambique in Africa, but also the Sudans, both Sudan and South Sudan. And in Asia, it's the case of Yemen and Timor-Leste. But it's not just oil which has its prices going down. Also mineral commodities like copper, iron ore, cobalt, etc., because of the slump in worldwide economic activity, their prices have also declined. And you have to think that apart from the LDCs which are dependent on energy exports, you have those who are dependent on metal exports, as is the case of DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Zambia, Guinea, Eritrea, Sierra Leone. Okay, these are just the most dependent ones. But also you have the issue of manufacturers. Remember, manufacturers, they made up 3/4 of the total exports, merchandise exports of Asian LDCs. You have a very strong reliance on garment exports. But of course, in the context of world recession, it can be expected that the amount demanded, i.e. the demand for the merchandise, the manufactured exports, particularly of Asian LDCs, will also weaken this year. So even if they are not dependent on commodity exports, they will also be hit by the slump in world trade, by the world recession. There's another channel through which LDCs are being hit, which is tourism receipts. As everybody knows, basically these days, tourism, well, the world tourism industry has come practically to a complete halt, to a ground. And it's not coming back to anything resembling normal activity levels so fast, particularly in what refers to long-term travel. And here that's a problem for some LDCs for which the tourism sector is very important. This is particularly the case for some smaller economies like Vanuatu, Saint Tome and Principe, Gambia, but also Cambodia. And there is another channel through which LDCs are being hit, and which is much more serious than the exports of tourism services, these are remittances. You know, I mean, remittances over the last 15, 20 years, they have become a very important source of foreign reserves for LDCs. It has become a major source of external finance for many LDCs, up to the point that they account for more than 10% of the gross domestic product of several LDCs, i.e. Haiti, South Sudan, Nepal, Lesotho, Gambia, Yemen, Comoros, Kiribati, and Senegal. So you see that remittances, they are important for all sorts of LDCs, for island LDCs, for large countries, for small countries. I mean, in the case of Bangladesh, for instance, it's not more than 10% of LDCs, but still of GDP, sorry, but it is still very important. And as you can see, that tourism can be important for LDCs in Africa, in Asia, and in America. So, sorry, remittances. So the fact that you have these immigrants, many of them are either losing their job, they're working less hours, or they are even being expelled from their destination countries. This poses a major, major challenge for the LDCs. And related to that, you have the return of immigrants. So for instance, Bangladesh has estimated that there are 6 million Bangladeshis coming back to the country. And so the question is, how do you reabsorb these immigrants into the national economy? Are they going to cities? Are they going to the countryside? This is most likely that when they go back home, they go back to the countryside. But then, what are they going to make a living from? So it's a double challenge. First of all, because the flow of remittances, which has been so important in terms of combating poverty, in many instances of paying for the expenses of health and education, etc., in the home countries, it's not there or it's reduced. And in some cases, you have these these workers coming back and they need to make a living. So again, this is a challenge. You have still other channels of transmission of the world crisis to LDCs, which is the reduction of capital inflows. Remember what I had said, that the LDCs, they have started more and more to make recourse to international financial markets, to issue bonds, etc., to take lendings in international markets. Well, now with the increased risk aversion and world recession, you have many less investors who are willing to invest or to lend money to LDCs. And for this reason, the interest rates that are paid on foreign debt, they have, by the LDCs, they have increased. For instance, the yield on the bonds issued by Angola, they have simply doubled to 12%. Remember, in developed countries, basically the level of interest rates is 0, if not negative, for sovereign borrowers. In the case of Angola, it's 12%. So it's a huge, huge cost of this foreign debt. But also because of this, you have had some bond emissions which have had to be postponed because of the very difficult situations. It's the case of Benin. So the question is, if you have less export revenues of either goods and services, you have less remittances coming in, you have less access to international markets, how are you going to finance public expenditure? How are you, LDC government, going to finance your development more broadly? So this is a big, big challenge. Another problem is that because of the situation of financial turmoil, etc., many of these countries have suffered from currency depreciation, which means that the cost of servicing their foreign debt, remember, the total stock of foreign debt has doubled over 10 years, And now the cost of servicing this foreign debt is going up on top of everything. And to crown everything, you have capital outflows and capital flight. Of course, we do not have precise data on that, but there are indications that after the beginning of the pandemic, the level of capital flight from several countries has increased. So all of this puts the LDC economies in a very difficult situation. And now let me just say something about food and hunger, because this is an additional source of fragility and vulnerability for LDCs. You have had, again, since the beginning of the pandemic, the increase of the international prices of some foods which are imported by many LDCs. Remember, most of LDCs are net food importing countries, and we have had some tensions and some rise in the level international prices of rice and wheat, and both of these products, they are imported massively by LDCs. Okay. So, and of course, there are differences. For island LDCs, 27% of their imports consist of food, but for some food deficit countries, it's even more than that. So it's more than 1/3 of total merchandise imports, are made of food. It's the case of Benin, Haiti, Yemen, Somalia, Guinea-Bissau, okay? So here again, you have countries in Africa and Asia and in the Americas, which are pretty much dependent on food imports, and the price of some of these food staples is going up. You have another challenge, which is particularly in Eastern Africa. You have had these desert locust swarms coming up in huge numbers. It's really past, and this has hit countries like Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and on the other side of the Gulf, Yemen, very seriously. Okay, but also on top of it, some countries have had some weather-related issues, like either droughts or on the other side, floods. So the issue of food security is a big concern for many LDCs. And this has, of course, a direct impact on poverty, not just the issue of food prices, but the loss of labor revenues, the loss of wages, the loss of work, etc., etc. And this is a simulation which was done by a colleague of mine, which is shown in that article that was mentioned at the beginning. And there you can see it's also an estimate based on what was the case before the pandemic and what is the case after the pandemic, from based on the growth forecast that we have now. And what we see is that just because of this, you should have 33 million people more than what you would usually have. So without the pandemic, you had more than 340 million extremely poor in the LDCs. Now it's forecast that it will reach 372 million poor people. And also the poverty rate, not only will it's not falling, but actually it is going up. It's going from those 33% of the population closer to 36%. So again, remember, it's a higher percentage of the population which is still growing. So I mean, this puts all sorts of questions into the possibility of these countries reaching even SDG #1, and I'm not talking about all the other SDGs. Okay. So what is being done to help the LDCs? Well, first of all, many of these governments have adopted, based on their fiscal situation, based on their fiscal means, fiscal stimulus packages, credits or grants to SMEs, some income support measures, etc. But the problem is that this has been far from enough. What about the international community? Where on the part of public creditors, there has been a suspension of foreign debt payments until the end of the year, and this has been adopted by public creditors, bilateral and multilateral, but only the public creditor. So there has been some sort of a meeting between the public creditors and private sector creditors concerning foreign debt of low-income countries. And as I said, in a sense, the public sector creditors, they are doing their part, at least part of it in any case. And whereas it's interesting that the private sector creditors, they say that they are examining the situation. But for the time being, that's all they are doing. This meeting took place in mid-April. Until now, nothing has been announced on the part of private creditors, okay? And in all fairness, the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, they have increased massively the loans which are being made available to all developing countries. You know that we have more than 100 developing countries knocking at the doors of the IMF, and it's slowly being disbursed. But what's the problem of this? Is that these are loans. Again, they are not grants. So what's the consequence? Is that they are further increasing the stock of debt of LDCs, which had already been increasing massively. During this emergency, it's increasing even further. Even if the debt repayments to the public creditors has been stopped, the level of debt is still going up, and even more so than earlier. And well, I mean, what would they really need? Well, I mean, the LDCs, in very broad terms, they would need much more affirmative and decisive action by the international community than what we have seen so far. We have seen some lip service by some heads of state of developed countries, etc. But we have seen little by way of real action. We should see some greater ODA inflows. Remember that the donor countries, they have a huge deficit in terms of the ODA which they do send to LDCs. Their level of ODA payments is less than half what with respect to what it should be according to their own commitments, which are, by the way, reaffirmed in the 2030 agenda in the SDGs. But beyond beyond the financial side, over the medium and long term, it's important to help these countries build resilience, because we know that these countries, they have a high level of vulnerability to all sorts of crises. Again, health crisis, economic crisis, climate crisis, etc., etc. And so the only long-term solution is to build resilience so that they can better withstand these crises, because you know that the number and the frequency of crises is likely to increase, whether these are health crises, climate crisis, or otherwise. So that's why it's so important for these countries to build productive capacities, to diversify their economy, but to build their knowledge and technology so that they can diversify their production structure. They can go into economic sectors with higher levels of productivity, which give rise to higher levels of earnings, and which will eventually result in building of resilience of these economies. And I'd just like to finish on a small publicity note that if you're interested on the LDCs and their development policies and prospects, of course, the one authoritative source of information, analysis, and research is the Least Developed Countries Report series, which is published annually by UNCTAD. So I think I'll stop here and see.
Thank you very much, Rolf. This was extremely enriching, enlightening, and depressing, I must say, even beyond expectations. We are always prepared to bad news as far as LDCs forecast in this context are concerned, but this goes even beyond what we could imagine, particularly in the medium and long term. I have already some questions here from Alejandro in private mode, and also Deva Brata regarding women. Maybe you would like to take Alejandro. Maybe you would like to explain what is in your mind.
Well, thank you very much. It was really a very interesting, and you almost answered to all my questions in one part or the other of your presentation. Thank you very much. It reminded me very much Gabriel Garcia Marquez, like this Crónica de una muerte anunciada. So there was a terror, and the question is what to do now? Is there a fatality? And if we move from the economic side for a moment and just go to people themselves, I wonder about the gender impact of this, and I wonder if there is any expectations or fear of social unrest in these countries. Because before the pandemic, we were worried about immigration into Asia, about possible wars in different parts of the world. And now social unrest, isn't it an issue? Thank you, Manuela.
Okay.
Rolf, you want to reply to that first?
Okay, yeah. So first of all, on the issue of women, I mean, in LDCs, you have a very familiar pattern that typically is the women who are very much concentrated on the lower earning jobs or on the more difficult types of professional tasks, etc., particularly considering that you have still 2/3 of the labor force in the LDCs who are dependent on agriculture, who are working on agriculture, and that you have a major input of female labor into agriculture, into family agriculture in LDCs. And of course, whenever you have this fact of job losses, etc., it's the most vulnerable workers, the ones who are fired at first, who lose their jobs, etc. And if this is the case, for instance, in the garment industry, which is particularly important in Asian LDCs, but also in some African LDCs like Lesotho, like Madagascar, etc. These are manufacturing industries which are pretty much based on female labor, okay? But this also means that it's women who bear a big chunk of the loss of income, but also of increased work and work share and burden in households. But also, since you have the increasing number of infections, etc., etc., it's well known that it's typically women who are the ones who are on the front line of taking care of the sick, etc., etc. Particularly, I mean, this is true all over the world, but particularly in countries where you have a relatively weak health systems, and so which rely more on family care, etc. Know that it's women who bear the brunt of this type of work. On the question of fatality, well, I mean, in human affairs, there's never fatality. I mean, the question is that there is fatality if nothing is done. There is fatality if we continue with business as usual, okay? And so let me give you an example. I mean, you see that the G20 has announced fiscal stimulus packages for their own economy. And this amounts to something like $5 trillion, okay? Coming from Germany, United States, France, UK, Japan, China, etc., India, Brazil, etc., etc. But if you take the donor countries, the OECD donor countries, what part of these packages is being dedicated to official development assistance? Well, the basic answer is none, okay? So what we could imagine is that one share of this, even less than 1%, it's not a lot, I mean, less than 1%. Remember, the international goal is for official development assistance to be 0.7% of donor country GNP. So if one small part of this were dedicated to ODA, this would go some way into this, okay? On the issue of social unrest, I think that we are not there yet, but I think the risk is high. And why is it high? First of all, it will depend on the issues of migration, on the extent of return migration that you'll have to going back to the countries of origin, which again, you will have to reabsorb these migrants back into the local economy, into the local society, etc. But also, and critically, the issue of food prices. I mean, we have experienced some increase in the price of some staples, but we are far from the situation of food crisis that we had back in 2008 and 2011. But I mean, when you have so many people which are in food insecure, either who go to bed regularly being hungry, or who intermittently go, who are in a situation, a temporary situation of hunger, as is the case of more than 16 million people in Yemen because of war, etc., etc. I mean, I think that these could be some triggers, and you have on top of it the increase in the level of poverty, loss of jobs, etc., etc. I think that these are some ingredients which could stoke social unrest. So I wouldn't say no to this.
Thank you, Rolf. I think you addressed the ODA flows issue that was mentioned by Cecile, but I would like to come back to that issue in relation also to something that you said, which is extremely important, which is the foreign debt issue. The foreign debt increasing, and therefore the service of the foreign debt also in a very critical situation right now. Some days ago, I think there was this idea of a plan, Marshall Plan, launched from UNCTAD side precisely, but also from some other former finance ministers of developed countries, a foreign debt moratorium. But I think it should be rather a foreign debt cancellation altogether for the LDCs. That should be the best, but not the only one, but certainly the best, the minimum decent solution in this context. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, and And I couldn't agree more with foreign debt cancellation, not just foreign debt moratorium, because with respect to public sector creditors, we are there. I mean, there is a moratorium which was put in place for low-income countries. But I mean, sooner or later, this is going to haunt back these economies, okay? So I think that cancellation would be much more appropriate, and several heads of state of Africa have very vocally called for foreign debt cancellation. But I think that also you have the difficult issue of the private creditors. And here, I think it would be important for creditor countries, i.e. developed countries, to do some sort of arms twisting with their own financial institutions. I mean, in the case of the foreign debt crisis of Greece, we saw private creditors taking a haircut. So, I mean, why not do this with private creditors now that we have this enormous recession, etc., and particularly because of the problems that this is, we are stoking for the future. So, I mean, even if you had even the private sector going to moratorium right now, this is going to come back sooner or later. So, yes, I mean, I agree that a cancellation or a debt reduction is the way to go. I mean, we've seen Argentina has just gone into moratorium again. So, I mean, I think that there will need to be some more forceful action, particularly by debtor country governments with their own private sectors. On the case of the Marshall Plan, I mean, this is something that we hear periodically. I remember when there was the big tsunami in Asia, that was back in 2001, if I'm not mistaken, there was talk about a Marshall Plan. Some months ago, I guess it was 1 year ago, Angela Merkel went to Africa and said, oh, we need a Marshall Plan for Africa. Now there are calls again. I mean, I couldn't agree more with it, but I mean, is it happening? And I mean, even supposing it's happening, the question is that the way in which these financial resources are used, they need to be used much more with a view to building the resilience of these economies, to building their capacity to withstand shocks. Because as I said earlier, there are shocks and there will continue to be being shocks, possibly of even more serious magnitude, okay? So it's important that whatever additional resource, first of all, that they are mobilized, that they are given to these countries, but that they are also put to very good use.
Yes, thank you, Rolf. I would like to move to Tess' question regarding what should be the position of the LDCs in the next LDCs conference. Since I think the agenda will be very difficult to manage in this context. What would be your ideas in this regard?
Well, I think that in a sense, the position, sorry, I mean, for those of you who are not so familiar, every 10 years you have a big LDC conference in which the international community draws up a 10-year plan of action for the LDCs. And there was one scheduled to be held in April next year. It may be postponed, but it will happen sooner or later. I think that the direction into which it should be moving, it's not so much changed with respect to what we were already before the outbreak of the pandemic, i.e. the need to have much more forceful action on the part of the international community, and particularly that the action of the international community is much more geared towards developing productive capacity, towards changing the economic structure of these economies, towards investing in countries with higher productivity, towards diversifying the economic structure of these economies. Again, This is something that we have been saying again and again. But I think that the present crisis, it has just made the need for all of this much stronger. Okay, so I think that there is a need first for a much stronger commitment, but also a different type of commitment, different types of priorities, and different types of engagement with LDCs. I mean, particularly on the type of donor countries, financial institutions, etc., etc. And I think that one area in which it's very, very important to act is in the reinforcement of state capacities in these countries. And here is something that, again, we have seen what are the countries, the LDCs, that before the pandemic have been able to grow at the most accelerated pace. Basically, it's those countries which have built some form of a developmental state, which have invested very heavily into some drivers of growth and forcefully, who have adopted industrial policy, etc., etc. And there are all sorts of practices in the donor system, in the ODA management system, which contribute to weakening state capacities, to weakening their bureaucratic capabilities, to weakening their capacity in terms of designing development policies, in terms of implementing development policies, etc., etc. So I think that if there's one area which has to be seriously tackled, is in terms of, first of all, of doing away with these practices which weaken the state capacity of LDCs, and more positively to actively pursue the strengthening of state capacities. Because, I mean, this is the basis for planning, for the design of development policy strategies, and also for their implementations. Yeah.
Thank you, Rolf. May I be a little bit provocative with Tess, which is our eminent participant here, because if there is somebody knowing about the LDCs, in addition to Rolf, it is Tess. Would you agree with Rolf's advice on not only on the conference, on the LDCs conference next year itself, but in the overall issue of the state capacity, which is also, by the way, a developed country issue, of course, with other quantitative parameters, but we are also in the middle of that debate here in Europe and in the US. Tess, I would like really to pick on your brains.
Thank you, Aniela. Yeah, well, there's no way I will disagree with Rolf, my friend Rolf. No, he's absolutely right. You are right. In fact, I am learning new things in my new role, having the opportunity to work in Ethiopia. And one of them is exactly what we're talking about, state capacity. Implementation is the most difficult challenge. Actually, these countries, they have tons of policies, or they have many policy advisors, and they have many studies. The number of studies you will not believe. Every time something happens, they do studies by international organizations, studies by their own researchers. The problem is implementation. Very few of these good ideas are either not implemented or implemented badly because of mainly the capacity of the state to actually manage this implementation issue. So I really totally agree, but I think the next conference, it did come by coincidence after the shock, and what Rolf has done is to tell us that many countries will be in trouble, but these ones will be in serious trouble for obvious reasons. So if the international community is serious about assisting these countries at the bottom of the development ladder, here comes the opportunity. Some of the issues that Rolf was highlighting, is going to be tested. In this conference, you cannot have any better signal than COVID-19 to show you that external shocks can bring these countries down to their knees. Now, international community will be gathering this conference. So this is the test, the litmus test for the seriousness of the international support to see whether there is serious actually support for them to move forward. And another area is how it's affecting their graduation. As you know that many countries are about to graduate. A number have done already. In fact, since 2000, when was the Istanbul? About 10 years ago. A number has graduated, I don't know, maybe 3, 4. But now there are definitely 5 of them scheduled for graduation. They're going to be reviewed next February. But now, including Bangladesh, there is a question mark, seriously affecting their prospect for graduation. So in a way, COVID-19 is a setback. In fact, this next conference, interestingly, is going to be celebration of 50 years since in November, what was it, 1971, General Assembly created the LDC category. And some of them have been LDCs for 50 years. Initially, they were 25. So in a way, it's really ironic that after 50 years, we still talk about LDCs. So on the whole, I agree with you. State capacity implementation is a major, major problem. Even if you have fantastic strategy, fantastic policy, even if you have the finances that you need, if you implement it not in a way that it should, then the impact may be disappointing. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tess. There are some questions or comments, particularly from Alejandro and Renata regarding, for instance, the debt cancellation, but in exchange of something, and this is the usual suspects that come, good governance and corruption. And Alejandro is also talking about that also in addition to the income redistribution or the redistribution of resources, because so far we are focusing, and that's correct, on GDP growth and other macroeconomic indicators, but other considerations have to come into the picture. I don't know what you think about that, Rolf.
Oh, well, I mean, what has been mentioned, it has a very good and simple name, which is conditionality, which is what every good developing countries is one of the things it most hates in its relationship with donor institutions, with donor countries. It's conditionality, okay? You get access to finance conditional on doing this, that, and that. And you know that, I mean, first, following the classical phase of structural adjustment, all of these issues of good governance, the famous good governance agenda, is something which started to be pushed in the 1990s, certainly in the 2000s. The problem is that we have been very critical with it, not because we say that good governance is not important, etc., by the way in which it has been approached. And basically it has been approached in a very one-sided way, in the sense of putting the emphasis on combating corruption, independent judiciary, etc., etc., etc. But the problem with this is that, first of all, it's a formalistic approach. It, in a sense, it's basically trying to do a transposition of developed country institutions to a developing country concept, okay? Not to say that combating corruption, having the rule of law is not important. Of course, it's important. But as long as it stops there, as long as you don't have the development of productive capacities, as long as you don't have more and better jobs being generated, as long as you don't have, okay, you provide better education to your population, that's very well and fine, but as long as you don't provide jobs for this better educated population, I mean, quite often this results in brain drain, etc., etc. So the problem is if it continues to be one-sided. I mean, we've seen this type of conditionalities for more than 20 years now, and I'm not sure they have been very effective. Okay, I mean, this push of the good governance agenda, again, it's been there again and again and again. It's continuously repeated, but it's not necessarily this which has led to the better development outcome of these countries. So I'm not sure that this is the area to pursue efforts. I think that really the area to pursue efforts is going to the roots of the problem, to the structural transformation of the economy, to the strengthening of state capacities, etc. And I mean, of course, having an independent judiciary, clean police force, etc. That's part of it, but that's only part. I mean, you need to have independent and competent bureaucracies, not just in the police force and in the anti-corruption institution. You need to have them in the industry ministry, in the agriculture ministry, in the planning ministry. Okay, that's why, and this is what is absolutely sorely missing in international assistance, is this type of capacity building. Okay, you have a lot of capacity building which is concentrated into some areas like tribunals, anti-corruption, or financial management. Okay, so basically some parts of the finance ministry, the central bank, but that's where it stops. But what about the rest of the state bureaucracy? So I mean, that's the problem. I mean, if you start cherry picking without looking what the real issues are, then it will not be effective.
Yes, thank you, Rolf. Well, as far as I am concerned, on my personal point of view, I cannot agree more with what you said. We have to remember that the first structural adjustments were applied to some Latin American countries in the middle of the 80s, and then in the context of the Washington Consensus. So it's even longer than what you say in terms of the mindset. And as far as I'm concerned also, I can only give my personal perspective and personal experience. In my career, almost 40 years career, I saw much more corruption cases coming from developed countries, representatives, diplomats, delegates, entrepreneurs, and you name it, than from developing countries, officials, or even private sector representatives. But this is only my own experience, it's anecdotal. It's certainly not the statistics, but it shows that the mindset, what you said, I mean, is also part of the picture. I don't know if there are other comments. Yes, there is, should we advocate a new HIPC initiative linking to the SDG agenda? Yes, regarding the cancellation of the debt. It could be a good idea, of course. If this issue comes seriously, as you said, on the table, it should be linked to the 2030 agenda and the achievement of the SDGs. That should be a good conceptual framework. What do you think?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. But I mean, remember again, even the HIPC initiative was again tied to conditionalities, etc., etc. And again, I think that we need to be very careful that, I mean, if there are to be conditionalities, they be the right one. Because, I mean, what we have seen quite often is the pursuit of some interests through conditionalities which are not necessarily the interests of the developing countries themselves. And it's with this that we have to be very careful. And if I just may add to what Manuela just said, where exactly do you find corruption, etc.? I mean, in our last LDC report, we analyzed in depth a new trend, a new fashion in development cooperation, which is called private sector involvement. And that's where you get very, very murky transactions between developed country governments and developed country companies investing in developing countries, supposedly to the benefit of developing countries. So, I mean, we certainly need to have much more transparency on what exactly we are targeting and through which means. Because, I mean, this particular one quite often on, maybe an exaggeration, but on several occasions, it ends up being, rather than development cooperation, developed country, donor country governments subsidizing their own private sector in the name of development. And that's the last thing which is going to help the development process of LDCs.
Absolutely, we should start talking about honesty and intellectual honesty on the other side also, and not only from the point of view of the LDCs or developing countries in general. I don't know if there are other comments or questions, or maybe I forgot something or something was missed in my column, which may happen. Sorry for that, in case. In the meanwhile, Rolf, thank you very much. I mean, I enjoyed very much, even if the topic is quite familiar for obvious reasons. But I enjoy also to see that many basic Prebisch principles and ideas can be applied to the post-pandemic consequences for LDCs and development in general. I mean, I always think that what Raoul Prebisch said some 50 years ago or more is still absolutely valid today, particularly regarding state capacities and the impact of the international environment on the domestic situation of a developing country. So it's always a pleasure to see that some people was very visionary. And even before we started understanding what development means, what really means. Other questions? Comments? Tess, yes, please.
My friend Simonetta was asking about the gender issue. That was not dealt with. This is number one. Number two, Prebisch, you mentioned Prebisch. I always wonder. I wonder what he will say if he comes back for one day now in 2020. And he can see where Argentina is, and where China is. I wonder what his reaction will be, because in his days, especially early days in the 50s, early 60s, the economists like him, they never thought China will be where it is now. They thought that if there is going to be catch up and breakthrough, from the south and from the periphery, they thought it's going to be in Latin America. So that would be interesting. Okay, thanks.
Yes, correct. On the women issue, we did not elaborate because we had exactly 1 month ago, if I'm not mistaken, a great talk precisely on the impact of the pandemic on women. Simonetta was one of our speakers on that topic, and you can find the record of that presentation, of that great talk, in our website on the same page where you have the link for this chat. So it's there. That's why, yes, Rolf mentioned some impact on women, particularly in the tourism industry and so on. But just to let you know that we addressed that topic of women specifically. This is propaganda for great talks, of course, as you could imagine. Other comments or questions?
I think there was a question of some practices. I suppose it refers to the state weakening practices of donor countries. I mean, this refers, for instance, to the fact that exactly because of concerns about corruption, lack of state capacity, etc., donor countries, rather than using existing state capacities, they bypass these capacities and they set up parallel structures for the implementation of programs, of technical assistance projects, programs, etc., etc., which has two consequences. First of all, it quite often provokes some brain drain from the state to these parallel structures because they are paying better salaries, etc., than the state. But much more seriously than this, it is preventing the state and the state bureaucracies from learning by doing. Remember, everyone learns by doing. It's true of companies, it's true of states, it's true of people. So, I mean, states also learn by doing and by making mistakes. I mean, no one pretends that any state will be perfect, will not be doing mistakes, etc., etc. But if you, on top of it, cut some states from one part of economic policy making and implementation and financial management, etc., and sectoral development, regional development, etc., you're preventing this process of learning by doing from taking place. So in a sense, you're emasculating even further national states. And these are purely donor country practices.
For elaborating on this, these practices that are also linked to the conditionality per se, which is a technicality more than a general attitude, I would say. If there are no further questions and comments, just as a reminder, this has been recorded and therefore you can see all great talks are being recorded and can be accessed from the website. And also, I don't know, Alejandro, if you want to mention the next great talk on Tuesday. Over to you, and thank you very much to everybody.
Yes, thank you very much, Manuela, and thank you very much, Rolf, for a very stimulating presentation and follow-up discussion. I think this, as Manuela mentioned, showed that the multidimensional approach that had to be done to all the current problems. We had a discussion on gender issues, we had discussion on social protection issues, and they were all linked to what you already presented. This pandemic has shown very important weaknesses of the system. You have mentioned that there have to be different types of commitments and different types of priorities. So I hope that in this huge crisis that we are just starting now, and in particular in the economic sense and in the social sense, will give us an opportunity to think things otherwise. What I'm afraid is that before reaching a new world order, we'll go through a new world disorder for a number of years. And as Raúl Prebisch would have possibly thought differently about the ideas, I'm very much with Tess. The ideas are quite often very good, but there's a problem with implementation and there's a problem with length. So I think, thank you very much again for this presentation. Our great talk next Tuesday, it's again with our partners in China, IO Talent, which is a group of scholars and students from different universities in China that were supposed to come to Geneva sometime in the fall in this year, but of course now they are linking and keeping in touch with us. I don't have in mind the program that you agreed with them, Manuela. Can you please remind us?
Yes, it's a very ambitious title. It is nothing less than the future of multilateralism, the view from China, the view from Chinese youth, particularly because this is a group of master students. So we will compare insofar as we have a position on that, but the vision from our side, our Grey Cells perspective based on our experience of being in the kitchen of the multilateral organizations for so long, with the Chinese young students' perspective on the future of multilateralism. I think it will be quite interesting.
Yes,
it will be at 3 o'clock Geneva time on Tuesday.
Indeed. And I think that these are very enlightening exchanges that we're having with these Chinese students. We had one with them last week, and they told us that they were surprised that the eyes with whom we are looking the crisis are completely different than the eyes that they are having on the crisis and on the world and on the economics and on the social impact from their side of the world. So I think that this gives us an opportunity to change and look the problems with a different and younger eye. In Gray Cells, we are committed to continue our not only multidimensional approaches, but also intergenerational approaches. And in Gray Cells, we're all seniors, most of us. And with these young participations, we also see how they see the future, considering that they starting now their professional careers in these very troubled times. Well, thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much again, Rolf, for this very interesting and extremely well-documented presentation. Time flew really by, and I think we could stay much more longer discussing. And hopefully see you next Tuesday, otherwise on a future great talk. Thank you very much for attending. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Rolf.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.